Amen. So just a little bit of review and looking at this section and talking about women's roles. Obviously, I kind of break this down in verses 12 through 15. Paul introduces, first of all, in verse 12, the what. Here's the command, and then after that, he's going to talk about the why. And then I think verse 15 is the so, or the therefore, if you will. In other words, here's how I want women today to respond to this in light of the things that he just talked about. And so, of course, the what is, again, verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. And so there's a lot of people that we struggle with this, and we might quibble over specifics or exactly how far do we extend this, what does this look like in the home, and there might be areas of judgment where it's as far as what is a woman allowed or unallowed to do exactly, but as far as the basic meaning, in a setting where men are present, he is not permitting a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. And I look at this in the organized, congregational setting. He does not permit that to happen. And so far as that's concerned, she's to remain quiet. And so because today, this is very contrary to kind of our modern eyes, our modern worldview, where increasingly we're not just saying men and women are the same. Now it's actually saying, well, there are no genders. Genders aren't even really a thing. So even that's just a social construct. So why would anybody be prevented from doing anything that anybody else would do? But there's a lot of people that meet this passage and try and kind of wiggle out of it. And one of the most common ways to do that is to say, well, Paul was dealing with something that was culturally specific there in Ephesus, which to an extent that's kind of true because they were dealing with a specific problem in Ephesus that we don't fully understand. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the commandment he gives is temporary itself. And the reason that I think that that's definitely, the case, that it's not temporary, that it's a timeless command, is because what he grounds it in. He grounds it in theology. He goes all the way back several thousand years before Paul existed, before he was a twinkle in the eye of his father. He goes back to Genesis chapter 3, and he says, here's why this is the way it is. And I think he's kind of arguing from the lesser to the greater. He's saying, this is how God set up the man-woman relationship. Man is the head of woman. He was created first. Of course, they are to be co-laborers in the Garden of Eden, but at the same time, man is the authority. Woman is to submit to man. And so he goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, and I think what he's implying here is the church should reflect the way the family operates. The way God organized and created the family and designed it to operate, the church ought to reflect that. And I think that you'll find that is just the case. When you look at churches and the way that they organize whatever they believe in women and men's roles, it's probably saying something about their theology as far as how the home operates and what men and women's roles are within the family as well. But it just makes sense that if this is how the family is organized, well, why wouldn't God's family reflect that in a certain extent? And so we talked about how he kind of gets this from both angles. So there's people that will say, well, the reason that you have man and woman submitting to man, that's kind of a result of sin in the world. And now we're in Christ and all the slate is wiped clean. But the thing is Paul goes back before the fall. And he goes back to just the very creation. He grounds it in that principle. Since Adam was formed first, he's the head. And the wife came after him, was formed from him, and so she is to submit to him. So that's pre-fall. That has nothing to do with sin entering the world. This is how it was set up in paradise. But then the other angle he gets it from is he looks at the cause of the fall. And of course, typically, when Paul is talking about sin entering the world, who gets the blame? Romans 5. Adam gets the blame. Well, yeah, because he was in charge. It happened on his watch. But Paul's digging into this a little bit deeper, and we understand reading the story that who was deceived? It was Eve, which is kind of interesting because that tells you Adam took and he wasn't deceived, which in some ways is almost worse. He knew what he was doing and decided to do it anyways, maybe is what's implied there. But my point is Paul grounds this theologically both before the fall, and then he grounds it in the idea that what caused the fall, and it's not just, oh, Eve was gullible or something like this. I think what this is highlighting is the way that sin was first introduced in the world was a reversal of the created order of family. Satan went directly after that. So when you think about it, the order is God is the head of man, Adam. Adam's the head of Eve. And of course, probably shouldn't even put Satan in the picture, but if anything, Satan's, he's to submit to us, right? We don't listen to him. He submits to us, if anything, if he's on that list. But when you look at Genesis 3, the whole thing is flipped. So who is Eve listening to? Who does she trust? Satan. She listens to Satan. And then Eve takes and eats of the fruit, and then what does she do with it? Gives it to the man who is with her. He ate. He follows her lead. And then, of course, where's God in all of this? Totally removed from the picture. He comes last. And so that's what Paul's highlighting. He's saying, here's the why. When you look at how sin first entered the world, Satan attacked, these roles. And they got jumbled and messed up, and it led to chaos. That's how he's grounding this. And then you get to this very interesting verse in verse 15. And so far the flow of thought is women's roles. That's the what. The why is talking about this, how Eve was deceived and what Satan attacked there. But then verse 15 is the so, or the therefore. And here's the response. At least this is how I read it. And so you get to this very curious passage in verse 15. It says, yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So anybody want to tell me what that means? We'll listen to you, and then we'll go home, and we'll be good. Sound good? This is a notoriously difficult passage. It's probably the hardest passage in 1 Timothy. And so I'm going to give you kind of where I'm at on it right now. My position has changed on this. It was somewhere different maybe a couple years ago than where I am, having most recently studied it. But this is just maybe a suggestion as far as what Paul is getting at. And so I thought maybe it would be helpful just to look at 3 different views. And actually in scholarship, I was reading somebody, they said there's as many as 7 different views. And so we're only really getting at about half of what's kind of out there and the way that is predominantly this text is interpreted. But these are maybe the top 3. And so that first one there, it toys with the idea of what this word childbearing means. And actually in the Greek and in the Hebrew, this word is actually pretty flexible. It doesn't just always refer to a woman actually giving birth to a child. It could be translated at times something like child rearing, which is, in other words, the whole just having and raising up a child process. And so when you go back to Genesis 3 and you look at the curses there, of course, what was the curse that Eve received there with regards to children? So pain and childbearing. And so there's 2 ways to take that. One is just now it's going to hurt when you have kids. But increasingly what people think it's getting at, what that curse is getting at, is not just the pain of having, actually birthing a child, although that would be part of it, but the whole, from conception to adulthood, having a child. And I think that's pretty compelling, actually, when you read the book of Genesis, because you see all of that in Genesis. You see women struggling to conceive, right? That's a big issue in Genesis. And then you see women struggling with the pain of that. Sarah, how much pain did she deal with when Ishmael had a child? She didn't. And then you do see women struggling with the physical pain of childbirth, where you see, was it Rachel who dies giving birth? But then you also see these children that are born to the women, they're just perfect kids, right? Didn't cause them any grief ever, right? No, you see every son, it seems like, that's born caused his mother grief on some level. And so what this view says is essentially, in the way it interprets 1 Timothy 2 and verse 15, is that basically, you'll be saved from that curse if you are faithful to it, if you do it in a way that's faithful to God. And I'll say this view is strengthened when you look at the grammar of 1 Timothy 2:15. And so what do I mean by that? If you look in verse 15, it says, she will be saved through childbearing. But then notice the change in pronouns after that. She will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So then what the view is saying is that the they is the kids. That the kids grow up, they're following God, you'll be saved from this curse. And so take motherhood seriously is maybe what Paul is saying. So that's the first view. It's a view that's been compelling to me and that I've oscillated between. The second one is less so to me. It's ingenious, and that's kind of why I don't know, sometimes when an explanation is a little bit too neat and novel, I don't know, it's a little bit of a red flag for me sometimes. But there's some that would take this that you're going to be saved through the seed of woman. You know, he's been talking about Eve, and we're told when God cursed Satan, you know, the seed of woman is going to crush your head, right? And so it makes it a statement about faithfulness to the Messiah. Through the seed of woman, you'll be saved if you continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. That's about all I can say about that. I don't feel as familiar with that one. But thirdly, and this is maybe where I'm at right now, I think obviously what Paul's saying, it cannot be, well, the way that women get to heaven is they got to have kids, first of all, and then those kids got to be really good kids. I think that we can all agree. I mean, we just studied last Sunday, Ezekiel 18, the soul that what? Will die. The soul that sins will die, right? Son is held responsible for his sin, father for his sin. Obviously, that applies just as much to women. So we rule that out. Paul isn't saying the way to heaven is you have kids, you become a mother, and you raise really good kids, and that's how you get to heaven. So obviously, that's, again, not what he's saying. But I think there's reason to believe that Paul means something different than final salvation, getting to heaven, so to speak. That maybe the way to take this, and this is a pretty prominent view, is something like you'll be preserved from Eve-like sin and the chaos that came through that by being faithful to God's design. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'll try and unpack that. But any other thoughts before I move on? I know I kind of just threw a lot at you guys. But no. All right. And I'll also say this, that, I'll talk about that a little bit later. I won't talk about that right now. So let me unpack this and just kind of relevant passages. I'm looking at how Paul uses certain words and kind of what the issues were in this letter that he's writing. And so if you go to 1 Timothy 5 and verse 14 through 15, I think that you're told something very similar to what he says here. And so in 1 Timothy 5, he's talking about widows and, which widows to enroll for benevolence and which ones, to not do that. And he gives basically qualifications, like similar to qualifications for elders. He says, here's the qualifications for a widow to be enrolled for benevolence purposes. And it seems as Paul's going through that he's seen a pattern, and he talks about this. I won't read all the passages there in chapter 5, but it seems like he's seen this pattern where a young woman will commit to remaining a widow, and then later on down the line she gets married and she breaks her vow, and Paul says bringing condemnation on herself, and is kind of led astray. And so Paul doesn't want that. He doesn't want a young woman to take a vow that she can't keep and bring condemnation on herself. But then also, he doesn't want them to remain single. He wants them to remarry. He sees this as actually being good for them. And so I'm looking at verses 4 through 15. He says, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. And so I read that, and Paul seems to be worried about young women straying after Satan due to their lust or being wooed by some unfaithful guy or something like this. He wants them to remarry, and obviously in the Lord. He's talked about that in other letters. And it seems to be with the implied purpose here, I think it's actually just explicit in the passage, that somehow this, if they do this and they're faithful to their female role within the marriage, that somehow that's going to keep them or prevent them from straying. But I think Paul's saying something similar in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 15. So let me illustrate this a little bit. Something similar has been said about men that I think is true. It's often been said that men are like pickup trucks. They drive straighter with a load in the back. Right? You guys ever heard that before? And the idea is if a man has responsibility, right? If he has a job, if he has a wife, if he has kids, there's something about that responsibility that's going to give him purpose, going to give him motivation, it's going to keep him out of trouble. And I think that Paul is saying something similar here about women, that he wants them to remarry, to occupy their lives by fulfilling their wifely, motherly duties, and that's going to create kind of a stronghold against Satan in their life. Something about that's going to keep them moving in the right direction. I think that's what Paul's saying there in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 14 through 15. And I think that's kind of what he's saying in 1 Timothy 2 in verse 15. Any questions on that? I got another passage that I want to look at, though, to make this case. Does that make sense, or other thoughts on that? Okay. So the other relevant passage, I think, for this is in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 16, where I think that we're seeing Paul use the word save in a slightly different way. Of course, you see that a lot in the Gospels. The Gospels use save, and is not always talking about, a person's soul being saved. Paul does generally use the word save to talk about, final salvation. But I think here might be an exception. So 1 Timothy 4 and verse 16 says, "Keep close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing, you will save both yourself and your hearers." Well, that's kind of an interesting thing to say because, if we're going to be real technical here, is Timothy capable of saving anybody? It's kind of a yes and no answer. But furthermore, isn't Timothy already saved? And his hearers, predominantly the people he's preaching to, are already saved? Well, what's Paul saying? He's saying to Timothy, your doctrine, what you preach, what you teach, has the potential to either preserve yourself and the hearers or to ruin them. And so preach sound doctrine. That's going to save you. That's going to preserve you and the people that are hearing them. And so I just use that passage to show that maybe Paul, it's an example of him using the word save in maybe a less technical sense than what we typically think of. And then finally, jumping ahead to 2 Timothy 3, verses 6 through 7. So this is where I say there was a cultural problem there in Ephesus. There was a specific problem to that time and place. And so you see this in 2 Timothy where Paul is talking about false teachers who seem to specifically target women. And more specifically than that, weak women. He's not saying all women are weak, but he's talking about women. He kind of defines what he means by that, burdened with sins. Just women that are vulnerable, that are not in a good place. And Paul's talking about these false teachers, and maybe they're the ones he's mentioned first here in 1 Timothy, where they would target these women. He says they'd creep in, like they'd sneak into households, and they would target them. And they're burdened with sins and led by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at the knowledge of the truth. The reason I think that passage is relevant is because it reveals that maybe the situation in Ephesus that Timothy was going into, while it was presenting problems for all genders, maybe it's possible that these false teachers were specifically targeting specific types of women. And Paul, trying to prevent them from being taken advantage of, number one, he tells them in 1 Timothy 2:11, I want them to learn. I want them to sit under you, Timothy. I want them to learn. And we've talked about how that was a progressive idea, actually, that women didn't really have equal access to education, especially in Jewish contexts. They'd have to learn through their husbands or their fathers. They didn't have at least as much access as the men did. And so that's progressive when Paul says, women have as much right to learn as the men do. But he wants them to learn, but he also wants them to, again, embrace these roles of wife and mother and as a means to protect them. And so those are some passages that I think are relative to make that case. As I said, that's a suggestion and how to take 1 Timothy 2 and verse 15. That's where I'm at. I might change my mind. For me, it's been between options 1 and option 3. That's kind of what I bounced between and where I'm at in my head on it. But other thoughts on this passage? Maybe there's an idea that I haven't heard before. No? All right. Okay, so if you grant me that, I think Paul's point here is there is some things only men must do. You know, he seems to make that pretty clear. But then I also want us to highlight there are some things only women can do. I cannot bear children. And furthermore, I'm not capable of what happens after that, right? The patience, the nurturement, the comfort, just what a mother can provide, it is not something I'm able to replicate. And I think, obviously, the husbands in the room know exactly what I mean by that. And then I think also we got to keep in mind, if this is what Paul's describing here, that the church is strengthened by this and preserved from Satan's wiles when genders are faithful to God's created order. Now, that doesn't just mean women being faithful to their roles. That means men being faithful to their roles. Just because you're a husband doesn't mean you're the leader of your house, if you know what I'm saying. Doesn't mean you're being faithful to that calling. And both men and women have an obligation to be faithful to their God-given roles, and when we're not, chaos and disorder ensues. And that's Paul's point in bringing up Genesis 3. I also want to talk about just some implications for wives and motherhood. Isn't this something that the world demeans? I was reading a feminist writer today, and she talked about how she wishes, that women didn't even have the option to have children. And she says just because it's an option, women are going to automatically choose it. But if she had it her way, through technological advances, whatever, she'd make it so it's not even an option because she thinks it is actually oppressive and demeaning and enslaving to women. Now, there's no doubt, being a mom has sacrifices, and it requires, a servant's heart. But that's exactly the kind of thing that God extols, isn't it? And I think what this passage is saying is that, motherhood, these divinely ordained roles that God has given, they are very, very valuable in God's eyes. In other words, what the world has devalued, God sees as being exceedingly valuable. And so I know that there's often, a little bit of a caveat that we want to add. We always ask, well, what about women who can't have kids or haven't had the opportunity to marry? Okay, obviously, again, Paul, I think he's picking the thing that's the most distinct difference between men and women. And it's what scholars would call, I'm gonna mispronounce it, I practiced it before I came in here, synecdoche, right? Synecdoche is like when somebody says, check out my new wheels, right? They're not talking about the wheels, they're talking about, look, my new car. And so Paul is using childbearing as kind of one part to represent a bigger picture of male-female differences and roles. And so it's not as though a woman is, not pleasing to God if they don't have kids, if they're not a wife. One person that came to mind was Lydia. I mean, how important was Lydia in the spread of the gospel? She basically offers her house as the headquarters for Paul's preaching there in Philippi. But at the same time, I don't want to caveat this to death because we do that a lot in our culture. And I just want to leave it at this. Being a mom, a wife, the ability to conceive and have a child, like what cooler superpower is there than that? And it is not a sign of weakness. Any man that has watched his wife give birth, you cannot say that that's that's weak. I couldn't do that, right? Let me get that out in the open right now. I could not have a kid. I don't know how they do it. It is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength and faithfulness to God. And I think that's heavily implied in this passage. And it's also a sanctifying work. It is something, you'll probably learn more about your relationship with God, raising kids, and being a mom or being a father for that matter, than just about anything else that you might do in life. And it requires humility, like I said. I mean, that woman talks about being a mom as enslaving. I mean, I kind of get where she's coming from a little bit sometimes, because they require everything all the time. They require your attention. They require, you know, it doesn't matter if you're having a bad day. You got to show up for them. But the biblical word is servant. It requires a servant attitude, both for men and women. And that's what God extols. That's what Jesus was all about. And it's this sanctifying work that draws us closer to God. And it's also a work, by the way, that it's not just that God sees it's important. How important does Satan even recognize it to be, when that's the first thing he attacks and the first sin ever, is the created order of family in God's plan. That's the first thing Satan goes after. And I tell you what, his strategy has not changed. What is the biggest issue in this country today? Families. Broken families. And just the marriage rate's going down. And people not having kids. And when they do have kids, they're not there for them. They're valuing themselves before those kids. Even a Chinese proverb recognized, I think, that there's this Chinese proverb that says that a nation is only as strong as its families, right? That is true. And it's the same with the church. Can you imagine a church where the husbands are leading, the wives are faithful in their respective roles, they're raising godly kids? Like, Satan doesn't want that. That's bad news for Satan, so he's going to do everything he can to attack it. And so it's very important that we don't devalue these roles as God's people, where God says they're very, very valuable. And so we always talk about what women can't do. We don't often talk about what women can do. And I understand, you know, doing a list like this, it's hard to make a list like this and not come across as patronizing to the women in the room. And so I don't intend to be patronizing. I just ask you to receive it in the spirit that it's given. There are so many things that women can do to serve the church that aren't even on this list. But let's just start here. Women, every man has had a time in his life where a woman taught and exercised authority over them. I'm talking about the moms. You have this time with your child to teach and exercise authority over future men and future women. You can evangelize and teach the lost. You can teach and disciple women, children. Women have done a lot in writing and scholarship. They can compose and write hymns, not to mention, you know, myriads of examples of works of mercy, service, hospitality. I think a lot of the frustration with this topic, what's at the root of it, is how much we undervalue these sorts of things. Like, we would look at teaching kids as like, that's consolation prize, you know, it's not the important work. I think sometimes that's more important. Because when I'm preaching a sermon, the kids aren't paying attention to me. But when you have them in that back classroom, even though they're crazy and they're riled up, you have their attention for 30 to 45 minutes, and to tailor make a lesson for them where they're at in their lives. And I think the kids' classes for me growing up had impact on me that cannot be quantified. And it's probably true for a lot of us. And I also think about discipling women. Like, that is sometimes something that's neglected. Like, I cannot disciple women the way that another woman can. That's another thing I can't do, at least as well as what another woman could. And so I think we got to be really careful that we're not undervaluing these sorts of works as well, and just saying, well, it's all about being an elder or preaching or teaching. This is actually where the real work is. And so that's all I got. Final thoughts, comments, questions. Go ahead, Ronnie. What's that, sir? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Why is Vicky laughing? Vicky's laughing for some reason. I won't ask why Vicky's laughing or else I'll get myself in trouble. Well, you didn't say that, yeah. Yeah, that's good. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right. Just like, how Adam got the blame, I think you get the blame on that one too. So, any other comments, thoughts, questions? All right, thanks, appreciate that. I know that's sometimes a hard topic, so, but Larry will cover for me next week, so thanks for your time.